elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 97, inching towards those 3 digits. We're very excited that we've been able to take it this far and that you've been joining with us. Brian is along my side here for this episode, talking about whether voting legitimizes government, whether your voting and participation in the process gives legitimacy to the system itself. This was a spin-off of a previous episode we were talking about, but it's an important topic to try and understand. It ties very much in, Brian, to the episode that we did earlier on about the social contract. We'll link to that episode on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/97, because it's important to understand how what your role is, if any, within the government to which we're all subject. I'd like, Brian, to start off today's episode talking about the holiday that we just celebrated here in America, Independence Day, celebrating this idea of, treason and tax revolt and secession and all these things that are, no longer in vogue in America. Now it's just boiled down to this superficial holiday of hot dogs and fireworks. But these important political principles at the heart of the American Revolution. And, of course, the Declaration of Independence kicked it off, right? And in there, there's a statement that was included that says that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And I think that is a very pregnant sentence. It's impregnated with power and with importance. It's something that we shouldn't take lightly. And as I look at that sentence, I think one of the key terms in there, one of the most important parts of that sentence, is the word consent. It's a word that has had increased attention in this Me Too era, talking about sexual consent. But here we're talking about what is political consent. One of the best ways to understand the terms, especially that were used during the time of the founding era, is a dictionary that Noah Webster spent, I think, 8 years working on, published in 1828. You can find it online. It's very handy. If you just searched 1828 dictionary, you'll find it. It's great to look up terms from maybe the King James Bible or the Constitution or some of these terms to understand how they've changed over the years. In that dictionary, here's how Webster defines consent. He says it's an agreement of the mind to what is proposed, an accord. Hence, he says, a yielding of the mind or will to that which is proposed. So it's mental, right? It's an agreement. It's yielding of your mind. And according to our Declaration of Independence, a government cannot be considered legitimate without this consent. So Brian and I are going to get into this discussion about if voting provides that consent, right? If it legitimizes a system in that way, this concept of, well, the social contract, you're part of the process, you've signed, right, even though you haven't. There are several arguments here that we're going to set aside for purposes of this discussion, where we're going to focus on voting. But there are other claims as to how we provide consent to the government. It's important to understand, though, that there are 2 forms of consent, right? There's this concept of explicit consent, as in the case when you sign a rental agreement or an employment contract, right? You've specifically signed on the dotted line to agree to the terms and conditions of that contract. That's explicit consent. There's this idea of implied consent, where your behavior or the lack thereof is what provides consent. So it's never an explicit signature, but the idea is that you've yielded your mind, you've given consent based on your behavior. So, of course, one of the key arguments is residency. You live there, therefore you're giving consent to the government that's there. That's very problematic for reasons maybe we'll get into on another episode. Another one is silence is consent, right? The fact that people aren't protesting, they're not in the streets, they're not, outraged. Polling indicates that, people tend to agree with us, that provides consent somehow. Of course, there are many reasons for which a person may wish to remain silent. Think of someone under an oppressive regime who fears retaliation if they speak out. They've not yielded the mind. They've not agreed. They're just, scared into submission. So silence is one. Obedience is another one. The fact that you're going along, right, and you're marching in the state's parades or whatever, right? Again, it's hard to know if you've yielded the mind. So, Brian, let's get into today's topic. We want to talk about, is voting consent? So let me just ask you straight up and get your thoughts, and then we can go into some of these other thoughts and ideas that we have. If I vote in an election, am I therefore providing the state, am I yielding my mind to the state? Does the fact that I'm voting show that I've kind of agreed or yielded the mind more broadly to what the state is doing?
This is going to make me unpopular in some circles, but I'm going to say yes, in the sense that by participating in the system, particularly if it's a rigged system or if it's a system that is set up to exploit or otherwise look after its own interests over yours, by participating in that system, I think a person could make the case that you are giving legitimacy through that participation. And I say this in defense of I have a friend I work with, the producer for my radio show, used to work at one of the big news stations in Salt Lake City. And he said he made the mistake one time of telling one of his coworkers, yeah, I don't vote. And they had this come apart on him. What do you mean you don't vote? That's the most irresponsible thing. And it was like, that's like, I don't know. It was a great act of sacrilege in their eyes that he wouldn't participate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to be fair, his reasons for non-participation probably are not as principled as yours or mine might be if we were like, no, I'm going to abstain.
Mm-hmm.
No, not my circus, not my monkeys. But the principle's the same. If something is, if the system is not something you wish to be a part of, then a person should be able to voluntarily say, nope, I'm not going to lend legitimacy to it, especially if you're being offered a false choice in terms of candidates. Well, you can have this one or you can have this one. Not that that's ever happened within recent memory.
Never. Let me spin off of that last thing you said to get your follow-up thoughts. Because, yeah, I think this is an idea that many people would disagree with that you have. So I'm going to throw at you a quote from Lysander Spooner, where he talks about precisely this situation of whether participation through voting indicates support for the state. So he says, so Lysander Spooner, right, this kind of, he's probably like a full-on anarchist, I think. This was a guy who set up his own post office to compete against the United States Postal Service. And Congress basically put him out of business. It's a fantastic story if you ever want to kind of see someone who's actually using market processes to try and undermine state institutions. Really interesting guy. But he has this tract where he talks about voting. He says, in truth, in the case of individuals, their voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed or surrounded by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights under peril of weighty punishments. He sees also that other men practice this tyranny over him by use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former, in other words, becoming a master of others. His case is analogous to that of a man who's been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man takes the lives of his opponents, it is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing, neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet. Because as his only chance of self-preservation a man uses a ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others, to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers? So, Brian, your thoughts on that voting is not an act of consent, but an act of self-defense. What do you think?
I love Lysander Spooner. In fact, it's funny. You bring him up. I had a Lysander Spooner quote in front of me, too.
Let's do it.
Just in case I needed it. But to the quote that you're talking about, I think it makes sense that for many people it is a self-defense thing. And I would back that up with how many people in the last presidential election were insistent, you have to choose one of these two choices, because if you don't, what's going to happen? the other person's going to win and everything's going to get worse. And if that was the first time we'd ever heard that, it might be like, oh, well, I hadn't considered that. But I've heard that every election that I can remember within my lifetime. It's always, you've got to choose this one, and it's the whole lesser of two evils thing. And there comes a point, and I realize not everybody's at that point, but where you have to make a choice and say, my conscience, which I look at voting not only as maybe a potential act of self-defense, but it is an expression of conscience. At least that's how I regard it. And so if I'm not offered a choice for a candidate with whom I feel comfortable lending my moral support and my voice, then I will write in someone who I believe does represent the values or the standards that I would want, knowing full well that the system is going to reject that vote and toss it out. But I still don't think it's wasted.
What if there was an option on the ballot for like a vote of no confidence, right? Do you think that would be a better way to convey a person's yielding of the mind? Like, look, I don't yield my mind to either of these two candidates or four candidates or this policy or whatever. It seems to me that if there was an option for people to convey their mind without being forced to choose between options, both of which or all of which with which they disagree, that could be a better opportunity. What do you think?
Yeah, actually, I would go for that. I think as long as you have the ability to, I'm searching for the right word, to abstain from supporting whatever the names are on the ballot, or basically if you feel that the choices have been unfairly limited, then you should still be able to exercise your conscience. For some people, that's going to be, I just won't vote. But like you, I take seriously that part of citizenship in the sense that I want to participate. I want to have that influence. I want to be an informed voter. I want to be rational about it. But sometimes the system, to my thinking, rigs the game in its favor, or at least sets it up to where you have the safe choices of candidates who will not rock the boat and who will not pose any threat whatsoever to the way things are currently being done.
The spectrum of allowable opinion, as Tom Willis would say, right?
That's it.
Here's another reason I find voting to be inadequate in gauging a person's consent. Let's say I actually consent to support a candidate. I legitimately support candidate A. I think candidate B is awful. He would destroy the republic and undermine my liberties and so on and so forth. So candidate A is a good dude, right? He supports the Constitution and he understands individual liberty and he wants to go and, decentralize government and tear down power. Awesome. So I'm consenting enough that I support and vote for that candidate to obtain power. I want him to be in whatever office he's seeking. So he wins, and he goes to, Washington or state legislature or, the city council or whatever. And for whatever reason, be it corruption, be it legitimate change of mind, be it high-powered lobbying, be it bribery, be it a threat, extortion, for whatever reason, candidate A begins to act contrary to the way he held himself out to voters on the campaign trail. And again, Brian, none of this has ever happened, right?
Never.
And so, whereas I supported and consented to everything candidate A was talking about when he was seeking power, now that he has that power, he is using it in a completely different way. It does not follow, in my mind, that I consent to what candidate A, or I should say office holder A, is now doing. I've not legitimized his use of power by supporting what he was previously saying. People can change, and the fact that he's doing something different, it does not carry my agreement over. I've not consented to the new. I've not yielded the mind to the new stuff. So in that sense, I don't think that participation through voting can be construed as consent, especially because even in the case where I'm actually consenting, I'll raise my hand and say, yes, I consent to that. That sounds great. I'll yield my mind to everything that guy's talking about. But now he does something completely different. Again, taking it back to sexual consent, where we all understand the stakes here. We give a number of excuses when it comes to politics, right? Like you can repudiate violence and theft and fraud and all of these things, but when it's the government doing it, how quick, Brian, are we to, as a people, to forgive and dismiss and excuse? Oh, no problem, right? That was just, there's difference. It's a double standard, right? Like the very same fraud and theft and assault and everything, even murder, is excused in 10,000 ways by people when their government is the perpetrator, which I find one of the fundamental problems in our society with the state today. But all of that notwithstanding, people are very prone to excuse things on the part of government that they're not as individuals. So I find it's easy when we're talking about consent especially to bring the analogy back to a sexual intimate relationship where people will not excuse abuse, right, whereas they do with the government. And so if you think of it the same way, let's say I'm in college, I'm dating around, and I'm courting this girl, we're beginning to date, things are getting intimate, and she's yielding the mind. She's consenting to that intimate relationship as we're going, first base, second base, whatever you want to call it. And let's say we begin to become extremely intimate, right? And something happens. Maybe I turn out to be a monster. Maybe I slap her around. Maybe I say something wrong. Maybe I begin smoking and she didn't know that I, was a smoker or whatever. Circumstances change. To assume that just because she was giving me positive signals throughout that early stage of courtship, to assume that those easy signals can be relied on for me to do whatever I want going forward, to assume that I can put on a mask, a face, right, pretend to be someone I'm not to get her to come along with it, right, and give me those positive signals. And then I can reveal myself, my true intentions later on, and say, well, no, you winked at me. You held my hand. Wait a minute, that was like 2 months ago, and you've changed. Like, no one in their right mind would think that I could continue and force upon that girl sexual, intimate relations based on the signals and the statements, even the explicit statements early on that she made. No one supports that. The same thing applies to politics. Brian, am I wrong? Why can't people connect the two?
It's a beautiful analogy. I think that's and for people who get uncomfortable because you're using an example of human sexualities as a basis, that it still applies. So George Carlin, very funny, often profane, kind of a contrarian. He used to talk about people would say, well, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. And his response was, no, if I don't vote, then the mess is on your hands because you're the one who voted. You're the one who put your support to whatever, this politician or that party or whatever the policy is. And I kind of like how he turned the tables. Now, it may sound like, just some, grade school back and forth on the playground taunting, but I think there's a case to be considered there. If you withdraw your support, and it may be through non-participation or it may be through writing in a vote, I think that does, in some sense, absolve you from the collective guilt for whatever disaster may come. Now, I would also say that with the sense that we're dealing with imperfect humans. Human nature is, give me a little power, I'm going to want more. So we have to realize human nature hasn't changed at all.
And let me use what you just said, Brian, to maybe provide a different perspective on the Lysander Spooner quote that I read. He gave this imagery of being thrust into a battlefield, and you have to kill or be killed. Maybe his analogy works better in an environment in which voting is compulsory, but it's not, to your point that you just shared in the George Carlin story that you were just referencing, okay? So because you can abstain from voting, it's more like there is a gladiator conquest happening over here to my left, and those who want to participate in it can, right? But you can also look at that, and this analogy doesn't work either for reasons I'll explain in just a moment, but you can walk by that and say, ain't no way I'm doing that, right? Like, I'm not going to go into that arena and subject myself to that. I'm just going to keep on walking. If you want to engage in that bloodthirsty, conquest, so be it. Of course, my analogy doesn't work because the effects of that process affect us. It's not like those who don't vote are not impacted in any way by the outcome. That's the whole irony in all of this too. Is a George Carlin can say, well, no, it's your fault. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. It's happening, right? And for those of us like us who want to impact that process to try and improve it in a better way. We see that gladiator contest happening. We know that the victor is going to oppress us all. We'd prefer a victor who's less oppressive, and so we're going to go in there and support that guy, right? And so it's tough to think, oh, I'm just not going to vote and it's all your fault. Okay, great, fine. If you just want to assign blame and be subject to whatever the results are. But I think for a lot of people, that's a very inadequate conclusion to draw.
I've had this discussion actually within recent memory with there was, I don't know, a discussion on Facebook. Imagine that. And someone was saying, well, you better take interest in politics or it'll take interest in you. And I know I'm being a little contrarian when I say this, but there are some areas of politics where I will take interest to the point of participation, but there are far more areas of my life where I just do everything in my power to make politics obsolete. In other words, I'm an agorist. I want to reduce my governmental footprint. I don't want to go ask permission to cut my kid's hair or to grow a vegetable garden. And so I live my life peaceably. I treat others according to the golden rule and do everything in my power to build a life that is as independent of political control as possible. Now, to some people, that sounds like anarchy, or that sounds like, chaos. But I'm just going to put it out there that actually it's a very healthy way to live. And it also helps to maintain the perspective of there are some places where we just simply don't have the influence or control to shift things. And I think politics, particularly at the national level, is the best example of that. Come closer to home or come closer to your locality, and that shifts. I think you do have more of an opportunity. Pick and choose your battles carefully. But above all, I think follow your conscience. Thanks for joining us today for Society and the State. This is episode 97. And stay tuned. Episode 100 coming up. It's going to be a doozy.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.